In the summer of 1590, a small band of English sailors waded ashore on a narrow strip of sand off the coast of what is now North Carolina, expecting to find a thriving settlement of more than 100 men, women, and children. What they found instead was silence. No smoke rising from cooking fires. No voices carried on the wind. No sign of the 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children who had been left there 3 years earlier. The houses were gone, dismantled with what looked like careful, deliberate hands rather than the wreckage of a raid. The palisade the colonists had built for protection stood empty. And carved into a wooden post, in letters cut clean and sure, was a single word that would haunt historians for the next 400 years, Croton. No cross beside it. No sign of distress. Just a word, and then nothing. The people who had crossed an ocean to build a new life in the New World had vanished so completely that not one confirmed skeleton, not one grave, not one certain trace of their fate has ever been found. This is the story of the Roanoke colony, and of the mystery that swallowed it whole. To understand how more than 100 people could disappear without a trace, you have to go back further, to a moment when England was a minor power on the edge of a world being carved up by Spain and Portugal. In the early 1580s, Queen Elizabeth I sat on a throne that was, in many ways, still vulnerable. Spain controlled vast stretches of the Americas, its galleons hauling silver and gold back across the Atlantic in numbers that dwarfed anything England could claim. Ambitious Englishmen looked at that wealth with hunger, and among them was a courtier named Walter Raleigh, a man known for his charm, his intelligence, and his willingness to gamble everything on a single throw of the dice. Raleigh convinced the Queen to grant him a charter to explore and settle land in North America, land the English would soon call Virginia, in her honor as the so-called Virgin Queen. It was less a scientific mission than a land grab dressed up in the language of destiny, but it set in motion a chain of events that would end in one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in American history. In 1584, Raleigh sent 2 captains, Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow, on a reconnaissance voyage to scout the coastline. They returned with glowing reports of a lush, fertile land, and with 2 Algonquian men, Manteo and Wanchese, who agreed to travel back to England with them. These 2 men would go on to play pivotal, and very different, roles in the story that followed. Manteo, from the Croton people who lived on what is now Hatteras Island, would become a steady ally to the English, learning their language and eventually being baptized in their faith. Wanchese, by contrast, grew disillusioned with the English during his time in London and would become one of their fiercest opponents once he returned home. Their paths, diverging so sharply from the very beginning, mirror the larger story of contact between the English colonists and the indigenous nations whose land they were attempting to claim. The following year, in 1585, Raleigh organized a larger expedition, this one intended to establish a permanent military outpost on Roanoke Island, nestled between the Outer Banks and the mainland of what is now North Carolina. This first colony was led by Ralph Lane, a soldier with little patience for diplomacy and a growing suspicion of the native peoples whose territory the English had settled on. The colonists built a small fort and a handful of structures, but they had arrived with insufficient supplies and even less understanding of how to grow food in this unfamiliar environment. They depended heavily on the goodwill and knowledge of the local Roanoke people, led by a werowance, or chief, named Wingina, who was later known as Pemisapin. At first, relations were cautious but workable. The English needed the food and guidance the Roanoke people could provide, and Pemisapin seems to have hoped that an alliance with these strange, heavily armed newcomers might strengthen his own position against rival groups. But the relationship soured quickly. English demands for food strained the resources of communities already stretched thin by a severe drought, one that triggering evidence gathered by scientists centuries later would confirm was among the worst in nearly 1,000 years. Suspicion grew on both sides. Illnesses the English carried, sicknesses their bodies had built up resistance to over generations, began spreading through native villages, killing people with no history of exposure to these particular pathogens. To the Roanoke people, the correlation between the arrival of the English and the arrival of death must have seemed like more than coincidence. Tensions finally exploded in the spring of 1586. Ralph Lane, convinced that Pemisapin was plotting an attack, launched a preemptive strike. English soldiers ambushed and killed Pemisapin and several of his men. It was a brutal, panicked act that shattered any hope of a lasting alliance and left the small colony surrounded by understandable hostility. Shortly afterward, the English were relieved to see the sails of Sir Francis Drake's fleet appear on the horizon. Drake had been raiding Spanish holdings in the Caribbean and stopped by Roanoke to check on the settlement. Battered, hungry, and afraid, the colonists chose to abandon the outpost entirely and sail home with Drake, leaving behind the first English attempt at a permanent colony in America. A small rear guard that Raleigh sent shortly afterward found the settlement deserted and, unable to locate any survivors, returned to England as well, though some accounts suggest a handful of men may have been left behind or lost in the confusion. Undeterred, Raleigh tried again the following year, in 1587, but this time with a different vision. Rather than another all-male military garrison, he organized a true civilian colony, families intending to build permanent lives in the New World. He placed a painter and cartographer named John White in charge as governor. White had actually sailed with the earlier expedition and had produced some of the most detailed watercolor images of indigenous life in the Americas ever created by a European, giving history a rare and valuable window into the Algonquian world of coastal Carolina before it was transformed by colonization. Among the roughly 115 colonists who sailed with White were his own daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias. The ships arrived at Roanoke Island in July of 1587, intending only to use it as a waypoint before continuing north to the Chesapeake Bay, where they hoped conditions would be more favorable. But the ship's pilot, a Portuguese navigator named Simon Fernandez, refused to take them any farther, insisting the colonists disembark at Roanoke instead. The exact reasons for this decision remain debated by historians, but the consequences were profound. The colonists were left to rebuild on the very ground where the earlier expedition had ended in violence and abandonment. Within days of arriving, the fragile peace was tested again. One of the colonists, George Howe, was killed while searching for crabs alone near the shore, an early and unsettling sign of the hostility that lingered from the previous year's bloodshed. Manteo, still loyal to the English cause, helped guide a retaliatory raid, but it went tragically wrong, striking a group of friendly Croton people who had come to salvage crops from the abandoned earlier settlement rather than the hostile group the English had intended to target. The mistake underscored just how fractured and dangerous the situation on the ground had become. On August 18, 1587, amid all this danger and uncertainty, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia, in honor of the land itself, and she became the first English child known to have been born in the Americas. It is a small, human detail inside a much larger and darker story, a moment of hope and new life set against a backdrop of violence, hunger, and fear. Just days later, the colonists convinced John White, against his own wishes, to sail back to England to petition for more supplies and reinforcements. White was reluctant to leave his daughter and infant granddaughter behind, but the colonists feared that if the governor himself did not press their case in person, their pleas would go unheard. He agreed, promising to return as quickly as possible. He could not have known that it would be 3 long years before he saw Roanoke again, and that when he did, everyone he had left behind would be gone. The delay was not due to indifference or negligence. When White reached England, he found the country consumed by an existential crisis. King Philip II of Spain was assembling the Spanish Armada, an enormous invasion fleet intended to conquer England itself. Queen Elizabeth ordered every seaworthy vessel held in English ports for the defense of the realm, and Raleigh's ships were no exception. White spent agonizing months trying to secure passage back to Roanoke, watching his window to help his family and the other colonists close further with each passing season. He finally managed to arrange 2 small vessels in 1588, but their captains, more interested in privateering against Spanish shipping than in resupplying a distant colony, wasted precious time chasing prizes at sea and were themselves attacked and damaged before they could complete the voyage, forcing a return to England. It would not be until the spring of 1590, nearly 3 full years after he had left, that John White finally secured passage back across the Atlantic. When his ship approached Roanoke Island in August of 1590, on what would have been his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, White and his crew fired signal cannons to announce their arrival, hoping to hear some answer from shore. None came. Rough seas delayed their landing for days, and when White finally set foot on the island, he found the settlement his family and neighbors had built simply gone. The houses had been taken down, not burned or destroyed in violence, but dismantled in a manner that suggested a planned, orderly departure rather than a sudden attack. Heavy chests belonging to the colonists, including some of White's own belongings, had been dug up and looted, likely by scavengers after the site had already been abandoned. And on a post at the entrance to the settlement, White found those 5 carved letters, Croton. Before he had left in 1587, White and the colonists had agreed on a signal. If they were forced to relocate, they would carve their destination into a tree or post. If they left under duress or attack, they would carve a cross above it. There was no cross. Whatever had happened, it seemed, at least on the surface, to have unfolded without immediate violence, pointing toward a deliberate relocation rather than a massacre. Croton was the name of Mantio's people and their home, an island now known as Hatteras, roughly 50 miles south along the Outer Banks. It made a certain kind of sense. The Croton had remained the colonists' most reliable allies throughout the ordeal, and if food had run desperately short at Roanoke, moving to live among a friendly, established community would have been the most logical choice available. White was hopeful, even eager, to sail south and search for his family among the Croton. But fate intervened once more. A violent storm damaged his ship's anchor cables, and his crew, already exhausted, undersupplied, and wary of the dangerous waters along the Outer Banks, refused to risk the voyage south. With the hurricane season worsening and his ships in no condition to continue searching, White was forced to abandon the search and sail back to England, carrying with him nothing but that single haunting word and no further proof of what had become of the more than 100 people, including his own daughter and granddaughter, that he had left behind. He would never return to the Americas again, and he died years later in Ireland, still not knowing the fate of his family. In the centuries since, the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists has become one of the most enduring mysteries in American history, and historians, archaeologists, and amateur investigators alike have proposed a range of explanations, each supported by fragments of evidence but none conclusively proven. The most widely accepted theory, and the one most consistent with the physical evidence John White actually found, is that the colonists split into smaller groups and integrated with nearby indigenous communities, likely including both the Croton on Hatteras Island and possibly groups further inland along Albemarle Sound. Given the desperate shortage of food and the constant threat of violence, joining native communities who knew how to survive in this environment would have offered the colonists their best, and perhaps only, real chance of survival. Later English explorers, including colonists from Jamestown founded in 1607, gathered second-hand reports from native informants describing people living among certain tribes who wore European-style clothing, lived in houses built in the English fashion, and were said to be descended from the lost colonists. Captain John Smith himself recorded hearing such accounts, though he was never able to verify them firsthand, and a planned expedition to investigate never took place. Archaeological work in more recent decades has added intriguing new pieces to the puzzle without ever fully solving it. Excavations on Hatteras Island by researchers including archaeologist Mark Horton and the Croton Archaeological Society have uncovered European-made artifacts, including a signet ring, gun parts, and fragments of English pottery, dating to the correct time period, mixed in among Native American artifacts at a site that indigenous oral history has long associated with the Croton people. This kind of mixed assemblage is exactly what you would expect to find if English colonists had genuinely integrated into the community, living alongside their hosts rather than simply passing through or trading briefly. Genetic and genealogical researchers have also pursued another thread, tracing a distinctive family surname, one connected to a lost colonist, through generations of a Native American community in the region, though this research remains an active and debated area of inquiry rather than a settled conclusion. Other theories have taken darker turns. Some historians point to accounts gathered decades later, during the early years of the Jamestown colony, suggesting that Chief Powhatan, the powerful leader who dominated the native confederacy encompassing much of the Chesapeake region, ordered an attack on a group of English settlers living among a smaller tribe, an attack that some have speculated may have targeted Roanoke survivors who had relocated northward from Croton toward the Chesapeake Bay, the very destination the colonists had originally intended to reach before Simon Fernandez forced them ashore at Roanoke instead. If true, this theory would suggest that some or all of the colonists were killed years after their initial disappearance, victims of the same intertribal and colonial conflicts that were reshaping the entire region during this turbulent period. Still other explanations, less supported by evidence but persistent in popular imagination nonetheless, have pointed to disease, starvation, an attempted voyage back toward England that ended in shipwreck, or even conflict with Spanish forces patrolling the coastline to prevent English encroachment on territory Spain considered its own. Adding further intrigue and confusion to the story is the strange saga of the so-called Dare Stones, a collection of inscribed rocks that surfaced beginning in the 1930s, purporting to be messages carved by Eleanor Dare herself describing the colonists' fate, including claims of violence, death, and desperate relocation. For a time, some of these stones generated genuine excitement among historians eager for any concrete clue to the mystery. But subsequent investigation revealed the vast majority to be elaborate hoaxes, fabricated by individuals seeking either fame or financial reward, a reminder of just how powerfully this unsolved mystery has captured the public imagination for generations, tempting people to manufacture answers where genuine evidence simply does not exist. What makes the Roanoke story so enduringly powerful is not simply the mystery of where the colonists went, but what their disappearance represents about this early, chaotic, and often tragic period of contact between two very different worlds. The English colonists who vanished were not simply victims of an inexplicable vanishing act, they were ordinary people caught in an extraordinarily difficult situation, dependent on the knowledge and goodwill of indigenous communities whose own lives, resources, and relationships were being reshaped and strained by the very presence of these newcomers. The most likely explanation, that they survived by joining the communities around them, is in many ways less a mystery than a quiet testament to the resilience of both the colonists and the native peoples who may have taken them in, choosing coexistence over conflict even after so much distrust and bloodshed had already passed between their peoples. Roanoke Island today is a quiet, windswept place, its beaches and marshes little changed from the landscape John White once painted in careful, patient detail. A reconstructed fort marks the approximate location of the original settlement, and each summer, an outdoor drama first performed in 1937 retells the story for visitors drawn by the enduring pull of the unsolved case. But the true answer to what happened to the men, women, and children of the lost colony remains, even now, just beyond the reach of certainty, scattered across old artifacts, oral histories, disputed research, and the single carved word that John White found waiting for him on that quiet August day in 1590. Perhaps that incompleteness is part of why the story endures. Roanoke does not offer the comfort of a tidy ending. It offers instead a genuine, unresolved trace of real people who lived, struggled, and vanished into the vast unknown of a new and unfamiliar world, leaving behind only a name carved into wood, and a question that has outlived every person who ever asked it.